parents were going to take me to juvenile home. So I ran away.
Wendy Mazares is attracted to more than just the glitz of Las Vegas.
I went in the Horseshoe Club because Teddy Binion was a nice-looking guy.
But fate deals her a bad hand.
The owner of the brothel took me and put me in this room. I didn't know where I was.
Teddy told him she would be like breaking in a new horse.
I was used horribly.
Now she must play her cards right.
He kissed me, and then it just went from there.
Before a mobster cashes in on her life.
They said he's one of the most prolific killers of all time.
What kind of psychotic person has his wife write a suicide note?
He pulled out the gun, and he had it at the back of my head. And he said, start digging. I've lived the life of a 200-year-old woman. I'm surprised I'm still alive. I probably could say I had a daddy wound because my father was absent all the time. But I was always looking for that male figure to protect me.
It's 1968, and Wendy Mazares is 13 years old, running wild in rural Nevada.
Las Vegas was a great place to grow up during the 60s and 70s.
Vegas was sort of a Hollywood playground. The Rat Pack was here, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Marilyn Monroe. But meanwhile, it was a small town with small town friendliness.
My parents did the best they could with what they had. My mother was gone from 5:30 in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. She had top security clearance to Area 51.
Area 51 is a U.S. Air Force military installation in southern Nevada and the birthplace of the nuclear bomb.
My mother always kept a tight lip on what she did, and she would always make sure and call home to tell us when a bomb was going to go off because the entire house would rattle. My father was a truck driver. He was an absent father because he was on the road so much. We probably saw him once a week, if that.
When they do see their dad, he is often drunk and abusive to Wendy and her siblings.
Dad, I think probably due to his drinking, picked on one particular kid and her brother, Michael.
One time, Michael snuck me out of the window, and we went out for a little bit, came back, and my father started calling me horrible names. He called me a whore. At one point, he had my brother up in the corner. He had his hands around his neck, and he was choking him. And my mother had just walked in the house, and she'd taken off her shoe, and she started hitting my father with the heel on his head to make him get off Michael.
Wendy dreams of escaping the abusive household and turns to the glamour of downtown Las Vegas.
I was about 14 when we started taking the bus down to Fremont Street.
Fremont Street was where the Horseshoe was, the Pioneer Saloon, and there was a Woolworth store at one of the corners where she and her friends would hang out.
One day, we took a trip into Las Vegas. We went in the Horseshoe Club because Teddy Binion was a nice-looking guy, and he walked up to us and offered us some ice cream.
He immediately had his arm around her waist. He obviously focused on her because she was very beautiful. She loved that attention and this sort of sense of respect that she felt she hadn't gotten anywhere before.
Teddy is the 26-year-old son of Benny Binion, the owner of the Horseshoe Casino.
Benny Binion was maybe the most famous at that time casino owner in all of Las Vegas. The Horseshoe was renowned for basically no-limit betting, and he took all bets.
I was hanging out with Teddy till late in the evening. and eventually it led into a romantic time.
Wendy is 15 at this point, but she looks much older, and soon her relationship with Teddy turns sexual.
Thought I was an adult and I thought I could do it on my own. And I would go home and my parents would be very upset because it was way past curfew and my parents had enough and they were going to take me to juvenile home. I ran and I called Teddy. Teddy hid me up in the casino. He started buying me nice clothes, jewelry, sent me to the beauty salon, and he started sitting me with gamblers, high rollers that would fly in. I would sit at the $1 million poker tournaments. It definitely made me feel that I was finally wanted.
Wendy becomes known as Teddy's girl and is on top of the world until Wendy's mother finds out and reports it to the police.
A detective started coming into the Horseshoe Club asking about me and if anyone had seen me. Teddy told me the heat's getting too hot. We're gonna have to move you to keep you safe. And so he introduced me to this good friend of theirs out of Texas. And he said, go with him for a couple weeks until the heat dies down. Before I left, Teddy says, oh, you'll love Texas. You'll ride some of his horses, drink some lemonade, and just kick back in the sun and enjoy yourself. And it wasn't at all what I expected.
Teddy's friend takes her to a seedy Texas motel.
Well, he said, now you need to work.
You told her, Teddy told me you'd be like breaking in a new horse.
I didn't know what he was talking about until they took me back into a room with about 3 other girls. And they were trying to calm me down. I was crying. I didn't know where I was. It was very, very scary.
Wendy realizes she's been forced into the sex trade.
Well, the girls started telling me that when the phone rings, we take turns. And I went to the room. A man started telling me what to do and what he wanted, and I didn't really understand everything. I was used horribly.
Wendy is forced to have sex with oil riggers and cowboys for 3 weeks.
My feeling at the time was, I need to get myself through this so I can live. There was one gal there that really cared about me. She showed me a little window in the bathroom. It was just a little tiny one, but I was so skinny then anyway. And so she helped me escape. And when I got to the highway and the cowboy with the white hat in the pickup truck pulled over, I felt relieved. I felt I'm in good hands now.
A few days later, Wendy arrives back in Vegas shattered, homeless, and broke.
It felt good that I was back in Las Vegas, but I couldn't go home in fear I was going to be placed in juvenile home. So I called Teddy, and then Teddy took me back to the club. I truly believe Teddy never knew that was going to happen.
Wendy is a problem for Teddy. She's still underage, and her mother might call the police again if he continues their relationship. But he has a solution.
Teddy said, I'm going to get you a job with another good friend of ours here in Vegas, and we're going to make sure that nothing like this happens to you again.
Teddy makes a few phone calls and then takes Wendy to a restaurant to meet one of his business associates.
Teddy said, that's him right there. Go up and introduce yourself. Tom had his very own booth. All the waitresses knew who he was. I said, Mr. Hanley? He said, yep, what's left of him? He was distinguished, and he had this great smile that made me feel warm. I looked into his eyes. They were stark blue, like they just jabbed right through you, and it gave me chills down my spine. He was a nice older gentleman.
Tom is the owner of an air conditioning company and also does work for the culinary union that represents Las Vegas workers.
We sat down and talked a little bit. People in the restaurant treated him with utmost respect, and that impressed me. He started telling me he needed a receptionist to just answer the phone, no pressure, no nothing. So I said, I can do that, that's great. Could have been a little job, but it still made me feel good about myself. Teddy did ask him, now she's gonna be in good hands, right, Tom? Tom said, of course she will.
And that began her relationship with one of the most notorious hitmen in Las Vegas history.
Wendy Mazzares is thankful for her new job with businessman Tom Hanley, who has taken her under his protective wing.
The following day, I rode with him in the truck. He took me to the business, and there was no one there. It was just Tom and I sat there and waited, but the phone never rang. And it was a pretty boring job, but I was still happy to have it.
Tom seems pleased to have company. Only 3 months earlier, he lost his wife of 40 years to a suspicious overdose of sleeping pills. His 36-year-old son, Granby, lives nearby and works with Tom, who lives alone.
Tom's house was an older home, but it was a nice home.
The job comes with room and board, so Wendy moves in with her new boss.
He made me feel comfortable. I thought he was a gentleman. I felt good inside. I felt good inside about the whole situation. I felt like Tom was definitely giving me a chance to straighten out my life.
Wendy settles into a routine, far from the abuse she suffered at her parents' and in the Texas brothel. But before long, she learns the true nature of Tom's work and why the phone never rings. His air conditioning company is a cover for something far less cool.
One day, Tom took me to a restaurant on Maryland Parkway, which everyone in Vegas knew the gangsters hung out. And when we left, I said, what are you doing in a restaurant like that? He says, I work for the mob. I was floored. I really didn't know what to say, because one minute he has the air conditioning business and the next minute he's working for the mob.
Tom Hanley's connection to the culinary union and to mobsters made him a powerful force in Las Vegas. A feared force, actually, more than respected.
And suddenly it started making sense why Tony Spilotro would show up at our home.
Tony Spilotro, people will know basically as Joe Pesci from the movie Casino.
Go get my money or I'll put your brain to sleep.
He was considered like an enforcer. People feared him for that.
Tom's son Granby works with Tony Spilotro in the infamous hole-in-the-wall gang, burglarizing jewelry stores.
Granby was a heroin addict. He was just very unpredictable and scary. One time, Tony Spilotro and his brother came out to the office. They wanted something from Tom. And Tom said, you want something? Here's something, you little. And he started shooting at Tony and his brother's feet and telling them to dance. And then they turned around and ran to their car, screaming at Tom, you crazy old man, you crazy old man.
Wendy realizes that even violent mobsters are fearful of Tom. And while she is under his protection, no one will ever mess with her again.
Tom made me feel very stable. He had a knack for that. He gave me lots of pretty jewelry. One day he asked if he could kiss me, and then it just went from there. Finally, I just gave in to Tom because he did make me feel secure. He was taking care of me, and he was looking out for my best interest.
Tom is 58 and Wendy is 19 when he asks her to marry him in 1976.
He said, you know, we really need to get married, and get married Western style. And I said, okay, that sounds great. When Tom proposed to me, I felt a little bit more secure. I know how sick that sounds, but I felt more secure because I figured if I was his wife, then he wouldn't hurt me.
You know, you've heard of sort of the Oedipus complex. He was the father she never had, and she was this incredibly beautiful young woman to him.
We went and got a marriage license down in Las Vegas. We went to a ranch in Colorado.
Wendy is not on great terms with her family, and none of them are invited to the wedding.
He had some clergymen come in, and I was dressed in a red square dancing outfit, and he was dressed in his Western attire. We said our vows, and we were married. It was nice. After we got back from being married, Tom scooped up all the beautiful gowns I had, and he burned them. An overwhelming feeling came over me that, wow, maybe he does care, maybe he's doing it for a reason. Maybe that life that I was living prior, I'll never go back to.
But this was not done with good intentions. In fact, this is the first sign that Tom will not be Wendy's protector, but her new controller.
I had left to go up to meet an old friend, and he had followed me. When I got back, I walked through the front door, and he was there with his fist clenched, and he was shaking, screaming, "Where have you been? I'm gonna knock your head off if you don't tell me the truth." That was one of the first times that I saw Tom in such a fit of rage. I felt, this guy's really gonna kill me. He's really going to kill me. It just terrified me.
She couldn't really have friends because he didn't want her talking to anybody about anything that happened.
After that, he never let me out of his sight. I was always with him, or I was with someone he knew.
Tension escalates one day when Wendy notices some jewelry Tom has given her is missing. Tom's son Granby, the jewel thief, is her first suspect.
I stormed out of the house, walked over to Granby's, knocked on the door. I said, "Where's my jewelry? I know you took it." He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "I'm gonna call the cops." And that was the worst thing I could have said. He was going to kill me right then and there. And he jumped on top of me, and he was literally strangling me. I was going in and out, and I couldn't breathe. I thought I was dead. And the next thing I knew, Tom was there knocking Granby off of me. And Tom said that I better be quiet and not talk to anyone, not say anything, or he's gonna come and get me. It put chills down my spine, and it literally terrified me.
Wendy Mazaris's marriage to Las Vegas mobster Tom Hanley has become an exercise in survival.
I felt more and more trapped. I felt like I was digging a deeper and deeper hole.
And Wendy's ties to Tom are about to be made deeper.
When I found out I was pregnant, I felt relieved again. If I'm pregnant, he's not gonna threaten to kill me anymore. Tom was very, very happy that I was pregnant. He said, "Oh, you're gonna have a little gooser. I'm so happy for us." And it made me feel good that he felt good.
But Wendy is reminded that no one is safe from Tom, not even the mother of his child, when she stumbles on a keepsake from his past.
I was rearranging Tom's suits, and I found this note. It was his first wife's suicide note.
Officially, Tom's first wife died from an overdose of sleeping pills. But does this note tell another story? Wendy's gut reaction is to give the note to Tom, but she immediately regrets this.
Tom sat me down and said, "Now you're going to write yours." And I said, "Why are you having me do this?" He said, "Just write it." And so he told me what to say. "Sorry, Tom, I can't go on anymore. Make sure our little gooser is well taken care of." What was going through my head at the time was, wow. I immediately went into survival mode again. I felt extremely insecure.
What kind of psychotic person does that who has his wife write a suicide note?
The suicide note was used to keep me under control. I was like his prisoner, and I would always have it in the back of my head that he has that suicide note. He can kill me at any minute.
In the winter of 1976, Wendy gives birth to a baby girl they name Amy.
I thought having a daughter, he would change a little bit, but he didn't. Tom started going to the deep end then. He started acting out, started just walking around like no one could touch him, started being mean to the people that he was around. We were at the Safeway store shopping. We were up at the cash register. Some guy had let me in because I had a new baby. He said, "Please go first." Tom took that completely wrong, pulled out his gun, stuck it to the guy's head, and said, "Don't talk to my wife." And the next thing I knew, we were running out of the store with this little baby.
Tom is quickly arrested and taken to the station, while police conduct a search at the house.
One detective said, "Are there any more guns in the house?" And I said, "Yeah, there's a lot." And I took him in, and they loaded up like 56 guns out of our room alone. Tom was up at the sheriff's office. They had not put him in a cell. They had not booked him. He called and he was screaming at the detective, "Leave my guns alone. I want my guns and I'll be home in a minute." And they let him go. That made me think that Tom was very powerful with the sheriff's office, and he had connections there. They didn't even book him. They gave him back all of his guns, and they let him come home. All I wanted to do was take the baby and run. But at that point, I felt it was impossible because he would hunt me down and he would kill me. He had the suicide note, and he carried it around in his wallet.
Soon, Wendy will be digging her own grave. Literally.
He tells her, "Dig more, make it deeper." And she is frightened. He is renowned as a killer. You know this now for a fact, and you think you're digging your own grave. What else could she think other than he's gonna put bullets in the back of her head?
Hitman Tom Hanley's powerful influence over the police and the mob turns his wife Wendy into a prisoner. Wendy tries to normalize her life by focusing on happier moments. She relishes the times they spend with their close friends, Al and Barbara Bramlett.
We went to Barbara's house and had dinner. I liked Al too. I thought he was nice. making sure my pregnancy went okay and always asking questions how I felt. He seemed like a pretty genuine gentleman.
Al is the head of the culinary union, and its members are 25,000 strong.
Al Bramlett was the top person for Culinary 226. It's the most powerful union in Las Vegas, representing casino workers. He also uses that position to exert enormous influence and power to enrich himself and also to inflict violence on people who didn't bow to his will. Al Bramlett also used Tom Hanley to threaten people who didn't unionize.
It seemed to me that Tom really liked Al. He was one of his best friends of 36 years.
In late February 1977, Tom comes home unusually late one night.
He came in, gave me a big hug and said, "I love you." Then he walked to the laundry room, took off his clothes and put them in the washer. You could see little spots of blood on them. Then he pulled out this jewelry, and one was a tiger ring. Later on, we got a call from Al Bramlett's wife, Barbara. Barbara was asking Tom, "Have you seen Al? He didn't get off the plane."
When the media learns Al Bramlett is missing, it's big news.
We have checked with a number of persons who were closely associated with Mr. Bramlett. We have been unable to come up with any reason as to his disappearance.
I saw it on the news that Al Bramlett didn't come home. At that point, I thought, tiger ring. That scared me right there. Could have Tom gone and hurt Al? Where was he gone for so long? I thought to myself, he couldn't have killed one of his best friends of 36 years. He couldn't have hurt him. What did he do? The following day when we woke up, there was a detective from the sheriff's department at the door and tipped off Tom.
Tom leaves Wendy to deal with Las Vegas investigators by herself.
I let them in. They sat in the front room, and we're looking for Al Bramlett. "Do you know where he's at?" And I said, "No, I don't. I'm at home here with my baby." And they said, "Do you know what in the hell you're living with?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Your husband is a killer." It was the detective that came over earlier in the day that told Tom what was going on. That moment, I didn't trust anyone. I couldn't trust the cops. I couldn't trust Tom. Who was I to trust?
If police know about the thing that he's doing, and even they don't try to stop him, what are they gonna do for her? Just another example of how trapped she was in this whole nightmare.
Tom turned up at home, and I told him about all the police, and Tom just said, "Oh, he'll show up. He'll show up. Don't worry." And then we started getting calls from Benny Binion, calls from other union leaders. I mean, that's the first time I've ever seen the phone ring off the hook.
Over the next 2 weeks, the police question Tom multiple times, but he continues to deny any involvement.
I thought they were protecting Tom. They're surely not asking him where Al Bramlett is. That's what kind of mindset I was in. Tom again leaves the city and he goes to Arizona.
And Tom's very worried. He told Wendy that she would have to leave the house and never come back.
He had me so brainwashed. At that point, do what Tom tells you to do. I loaded up a bunch of boxes and documents and stuff, and they went into storage.
When Tom returns, he tells Wendy to arrange a sitter for Amy. He is taking Wendy for a drive in the desert.
And he kept assuring me everything was going to be okay, but I better keep my mouth shut.
Tom has a stash of clothes and jewelry he wants to get rid of.
We had a little ranch out in Pahrump. And he dug a hole And he said, always remember where this is. I said, okay. He dropped the jewelry in the hole.
Then Tom plants a tree to mark the location.
In my mind, I'm thinking, is this really Al's jewelry? All I wanted was for Al to be okay. We got back in the vehicle. He pulls along the side of one of the canyons and he said, come follow me. He says, start digging a hole. And he pulled out the gun and he had it at the back of my head. And he said, start digging. So I got on my hands and knees and I was digging with my hands.
By this time, Wendy has seen too much, and she is a liability for Tom.
And he cocked the gun, and I thought he was gonna kill me.
Tom Hanley is about to pull the trigger on his wife, Wendy Mazaris.
I started begging him, please, let me be with our daughter. She needs a mother. She needs a father. Please let me be with my daughter. And he let me up. And he let me get back up and walk to the truck. He turned to me and he said, you're probably right. Amy does need someone to be with her. And then we just started driving. All I could think to myself is the clothes that he had put in the hole smelled like Al Bramlett.
3 weeks after Al Bramlett disappears, hikers near Nevada's Potosi Mountain come across a gruesome sight.
The search for Al Bramlett has ended here in the desert just 2 weeks from the night he disappeared.
An autopsy shows he was executed with multiple gunshots to the head.
My heart sunk because I always in the back of my mind thought that Al was just going to show up, that maybe they had him tied up somewhere or something and everything was going to be okay, but it wasn't. He was gone.
After the news breaks, police pay another visit to Wendy.
They said, do you know who your husband is and what he does? And I said, he owns the air conditioning business. They said, no, he's one of the most prolific killers of all time. It was so shocking to hear that come out of homicide detectives' mouths. Was I in denial? Probably yes. Was I brainwashed? Yes. It was just a horrible, horrible life.
He was thought of to have killed an FBI agent, William Coulthard. He was thought to have bombed 2 restaurants, the Alpine Village and the Starboard Tack. The rationale was the Culinary Union wanted them in the union and they didn't want to unionize.
Tom has gotten away with murder before, but this time, a tipster gives police a break in the Al Bramlett murder case.
An informant came to them and said that he was there when Al Bramlett was killed and that he was with Tom and Grammy Hanley, who actually did the killing.
The Hanleys were upset because a couple of bombs they had planted didn't go off at businesses in Las Vegas that Bramlett wanted blown up. So, according to the Hanleys, Bramlett didn't pay them for that, $10,000. So they go to shake down Al Bramlett.
Bramlett was kidnapped from the airport parking lot.
They go into the desert outside of Las Vegas. At some point, Tom says, hey, Al. Al turns around and he shoots him in the head. He ended up getting shot 6 times, including once in each ear. All his clothes were taken off of him. He was buried under a pile of rocks in the desert with his hands sticking up to wave goodbye to the world.
A warrant is put out for the father and son fugitives, and on April 29, 1977, Granby and Tom are arrested in Phoenix, Arizona.
It was a media frenzy, and it was a frenzy at the Hanley house as well.
It was astonishing news. It felt good. It really did. But it took a few days for it to sink in. Were they going to let him go again? Was he locked up for good? Tom really did kill one of his best friends. He took him out and he killed him, just like he was going to do to me.
Tom and Granby are flown from Phoenix to Las Vegas to be tried for murder. When they land, Tom gives a statement while in handcuffs.
I never had any animosity towards Al Bramlett. He was one of the best friends I ever had.
After Tom's arrest, a mobster friend convinces Wendy to tell him what she knows.
I went out to the little ranch in Pahrump and I pointed to the tree that Tom had dug and buried.
Underneath the tree, they find Al Bramlett's jewelry.
And then everything just went crazy. A helicopter came down, all kinds of police came from everywhere. We were pulled over. The homicide detective said, "You're under arrest, baby." I did not realize that he was an informant and working undercover with the police. I'm thinking, I didn't kill anyone, I didn't do anything.
Wendy is charged with receiving stolen property and for murder.
When you're charged with such a substantial charge like that, your whole life flashes ahead of you. And then on one day, workers in the jail stopped the elevator and then they pulled Tom in there in the elevator with me. And then he started telling me, "Don't you say anything, everything's gonna be all right." So he had connections all the way inside the jail too. There was never any escape because the environment that I lived in with Tom, all of his problems came on me. That's what happens when you live with somebody like that. You get blamed too. How do I get rid of this guy? He's still gonna haunt me. He still knows people. He's gonna hurt me one way or another. I went to court and the charge was reduced to accessory to murder. And eventually the charge was dropped. I still had to do a year probation, but I felt a tremendous relief when they knew I didn't have anything to do with it.
By early 1978, the trial creates a media circus, with Wendy trapped defending Tom for fear of reprisal.
Do you think that Tom can get a fair trial here in Las Vegas?
No, he can't.
Why is that?
Publicity.
Have you,
The publicity is destroying him.
On March 2nd, 1978, Tom and Granby plead guilty to the murder of Al Bramlett and the restaurant bombings. They are sentenced to life without parole.
He was found guilty, and just a big sigh of relief came over me again. If Tom would have walked out of that courtroom a free man, there would have been a lot of people dead. A lot of people.
In return for them giving information on the mob, Tom and Granby are placed into witness protection within the prison system.
I felt bad for our daughter, Amy. I was able to disassociate myself with him and stand back and see everything he put me through.
After the trial, Wendy moves to California and attends college to try and start a normal life. She is only 22 years old.
There is no depths to a man like Tom Hanley. Once you're in their world, it's very hard to escape. And it was for me. I had to learn the hard way.
Years after escaping Tom Hanley, Wendy finds the courage to tell her story. She publishes a book about her experience as a mob wife called Vegas Ragdoll. Today, Wendy has been happily married for 25 years. And unlike many men in her life, This one is special.
She definitely had guardian angels, probably one on each shoulder.
We're complete opposites, but he does love and he protects me. He's a true husband.
Wendy's a very loving, strong person with convictions that will carry to the end.
He accepts me for who I am. He's taught me how to trust a little bit more.
Yeah, she met me, and I guess I was like the savior of her life for real, because I'll never let anything happen to her.
He truly loves me and I love him. And I searched and searched and I finally found the right man, a good man.
The call came in just after midnight, the kind of hour when truth is supposed to stay buried and lies feel safest in the dark. The dispatcher wrote it down in careful block letters, paused, then read it again because what was being said didn't sound like a prank and didn't sound like a confession either. It sounded like someone finally losing the ability to stay silent. Somewhere in Michigan, someone claimed they knew what happened in the winter of 2001. The year a young woman vanished without leaving so much as a footprint behind. The year a town learned a new phrase it would never forget. Cold case. Back then, Michigan was wrapped in snow and routine. The kind of place where headlights passing at night were familiar, where strangers stood out, where neighbors recognized each other's footsteps on the sidewalk. The woman at the center of this story fit perfectly into that landscape. She had a job that paid the bills, a small apartment with a light that usually stayed on late, and a habit of calling her sister every Sunday evening. She was known, she was visible, and then suddenly she was gone. No struggle, no goodbye note, no broken window. Just absence, sharp and immediate, like a door slammed shut in the middle of a sentence. The morning she didn't show up for work, no one panicked. Cars fail. Alarms don't go off. People oversleep. By noon, coworkers were checking their phones. By evening, her sister was knocking on the apartment door, listening to the echo of her own breath in the hallway. The door was locked. Inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. Her coat was gone. Her keys were missing. Her wallet wasn't on the table. But her bed was made, her dishes were clean, and her answering machine held no frantic messages, only silence stretching forward like a warning. Police arrived with notebooks and calm voices, asking the usual questions, tracing the usual paths. When was she last seen? Who spoke to her last? Did she have problems? Enemies? Secrets? The answers came quickly and led nowhere. She had left work at the usual time. She had stopped by a gas station, captured on a grainy security camera, buying coffee she never finished. She had waved to someone outside, someone just out of frame. That image would be replayed for years, slowed down, zoomed in, studied until the pixels broke apart, until speculation replaced certainty. Was that a smile? A nod? Recognition? Or fear? Within days, the story moved beyond family and friends. It spilled into the town, into the local news, into whispered conversations at grocery stores and gas pumps. Missing woman. No signs of foul play. Police searching nearby areas. Volunteers walked the woods with flashlights, boots crunching through snow that seemed determined to erase every trace. Dogs followed scents that ended abruptly, as if she had stepped into thin air. Helicopters scanned frozen fields that reflected nothing back. Each search ended the same way, with tired faces and unanswered questions. Weeks passed, and the tone shifted. The headlines grew heavier. Mystery deepens. No new leads. That was when the phrase cold case first appeared, not officially, not yet, but in the way people spoke about it, as if the temperature had dropped around the investigation itself. Detectives kept working, kept interviewing, kept checking alibis that were solid on paper but fragile in the mind. A former boyfriend with a temper, cleared but not forgotten. A coworker who stayed late that night, cooperative, helpful, and unforgettable to the rumor mill. A neighbor who heard something maybe or thought they did after the fact. Every lead promised something and delivered nothing. Phone records showed calls that meant nothing. Credit cards stayed untouched. Bank accounts froze in time. It was as if her life had been paused mid-frame, the rest of the film missing. The town adjusted, but not easily. Parents walked their kids to school. Doors locked earlier. Strangers were watched longer. Trust thinned, invisible but real, stretching between people like ice that might crack under the wrong step. By the end of the first year, the investigation slowed, not because anyone wanted it to, but because momentum had run out. Files thickened. Evidence boxes gathered dust. New cases arrived, louder, bloodier, easier to define. The woman's face still hung on bulletin boards, still appeared in anniversary articles, but the energy was gone. This was the part no one likes to talk about, the long middle where hope becomes habit and grief learns how to sit quietly in the background. Time did what it always does. It moved on. Streets were repaved. Stores changed names. People grew older, married, moved away. And yet, the case remained, unresolved, whispering from the edges of memory. Detectives rotated out. New ones read the file, shook their heads, tried a few angles, then added their own notes to the pile. No clear suspects. Timeline incomplete. Cause unknown. The words repeated like a refrain. Then, years later, the call came. Not a confession, not a scream, just information offered carefully, as if testing the weight of it. The anonymous tip didn't solve anything on its own. It didn't point to a body or a weapon or a clear motive. What it did was reopen a door that had been closed for so long people forgot what was behind it. A name resurfaced, one that had been mentioned early on and then dismissed. A detail, once considered insignificant, now glowed with new meaning under fresh eyes. Detectives pulled the old boxes back into the light. They listened to tapes with better equipment. They compared timelines that had never been laid side by side. The town felt it before it heard it. Police cars parked where they hadn't parked in years. Questions returned, sharper this time. Did you know her well? Where were you that night? Who did she trust? The phrase cold case was no longer spoken in past tense. It was alive again, restless, demanding attention. And yet, for all the renewed energy, nothing definitive emerged. The tip led to interviews, the interviews led to contradictions, and the contradictions led right back to uncertainty. Progress without resolution. Movement without closure. The kind of development that excites headlines but deepens the ache underneath. Because every answer seemed to open two more questions, and every possibility carried consequences too heavy to ignore. Somewhere in Michigan, the winter air still remembers 2001. It remembers the night a routine life slipped into mystery. It remembers the years of waiting, the anniversaries marked by candles and newspaper columns. And now, with the case stirred back to life, the town waits again, caught between hope and dread, knowing that whatever the truth is, it has been patient, and it is not done yet. Winter returned the way it always does in Michigan, quietly at first, then all at once, pressing its weight against windows and memory alike. The renewed investigation moved through that cold with purpose, not loudly, not publicly, but with the slow persistence of people who had learned how easily noise could spook the truth back into hiding. Detectives reread reports written by hands long since retired, followed lines that once seemed straight and now bent under scrutiny, and noticed what earlier eyes had skimmed past because there had been too much to look at and not enough time to look closely. They started with the night itself, compressing it until it felt small enough to hold. The woman left work as usual, said goodbye to coworkers who would later swear nothing seemed off, and drove toward home along a route she had taken hundreds of times. Traffic cameras showed her car passing an intersection at a precise minute that no one had questioned before. Now that minute mattered. It intersected with another timeline, another vehicle, another person who claimed to be somewhere else entirely. The anonymous tip had not accused. It had suggested. It had said, "Look again, and this time don't assume coincidence." At the gas station, the footage was sharper than memory but blurrier than truth. She stood at the counter, hands wrapped around a paper cup, eyes briefly lifting toward the door. Someone entered. The camera didn't catch their face. Only a shoulder, a jacket sleeve, a motion that suggested familiarity or at least recognition. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She paid, left, and that was the last confirmed image of her alive. For years, investigators had treated that moment as neutral. Now they treated it as loaded. They canvassed again, knocking on doors that had once been answered with sympathy and were now met with suspicion. People had had years to rehearse their stories, years to forget details they hadn't thought important, years to believe that whatever they knew no longer mattered. Some were defensive, others relieved, eager to talk, eager to finally unload thoughts that had never quite gone quiet. One neighbor remembered headlights idling longer than usual. Another recalled a voice raised, maybe just the radio. Each recollection slid into the next, imperfect, overlapping, creating a mosaic that refused to settle into a single image. The tip pointed them toward a name not new, but newly framed. Someone who had been near her orbit without ever being central to it. Someone who knew her schedule well enough to predict her movements but not well enough to be immediately obvious. This person had been interviewed once, briefly, their answers neat, their alibi tidy. At the time, it had been enough. Now it wasn't. The detectives noticed the pauses in the old transcript, the moments where the recorder hummed and the speaker recalibrated. They wondered what had been said off tape, what had been thought but not voiced. When they brought this person back in, years had reshaped them. Hair thinner, posture heavier, confidence dulled at the edges. The questions were the same, but the room felt different. The person answered calmly, too calmly some thought, repeating the old story with only minor variations. Memory is unreliable, the detectives reminded themselves. But lies often strive for consistency that memory can't maintain. They pressed gently, then harder, watching for cracks that never quite appeared. What they did see was irritation, a flicker of something like fear, quickly smoothed away. Outside the interview room, the town buzzed with renewed speculation. Social media filled the gaps left by official silence, turning fragments into theories and theories into certainty. Old suspicions resurfaced, names were whispered again, and the woman's face, frozen at the age she had disappeared, circulated with captions that promised answers this time. Families who had moved on were pulled back into the gravity of it, reminded that closure was a privilege they had never been granted. The investigation widened, not outward, but backward. Detectives examined relationships that predated the disappearance, tracing subtle tensions that had seemed irrelevant at the time. A disagreement over money, promise broken, a favor owed and never repaid. None of it screamed motive, but together, they suggested friction beneath an otherwise ordinary surface. They revisited phone records, this time not just looking for who called whom, but for patterns, rhythms, silences. A number that stopped appearing weeks before the night in question. A call made and deleted. Small anomalies that only mattered because everything else had failed to explain what happened. Evidence such as it was resisted interpretation. No blood, no damaged vehicle, no personal items recovered beyond what she had carried with her that night and never used again. The absence itself became a clue, implying control, planning, restraint. This was not chaos. This was someone who knew how to leave nothing behind, or someone who had been extraordinarily lucky. Either possibility unsettled the investigators, because luck runs out, but skill adapts. As months passed, the anonymous tip's origin remained a mystery. Calls to the tip line went unanswered. Emails bounced back. Whoever had spoken up had done so once and vanished again, leaving behind only the echo of their words. Detectives debated the motive behind it. Guilt? Fear? Revenge? Or a simple inability to carry the weight any longer. They knew that sometimes, the truth arrives not as a confession but as a nudge, a destabilizing force that shifts the entire structure just enough to expose what was hidden. The woman's family watched all of this from a distance that felt both protective and punishing. They were informed, but not included. Promised progress, but not certainty. Each update reopened wounds they had learned to bandage. Hope, once raw and desperate, had matured into something cautious, almost superstitious. They wanted answers, but they also feared them. After so many years, the truth could only hurt. The only question was how. The cold case unit worked late into nights that felt eerily similar to the one that started it all. Coffee cups piled up. Walls filled with timelines and photographs. Arrows connecting moments that might never truly connect. They argued about theories, discarded them, resurrected them. One detective fixated on the gas station. Another on a stretch of road just outside town where cell signals dropped. A third couldn't shake the feeling that the answer had been sitting in the file from the beginning, misfiled under assumptions no one had questioned until now. And then there were the rumors, persistent and corrosive, that someone had talked years ago and been ignored, that evidence had been mishandled, that the truth was known but inconvenient. None of it could be proven, but all of it influenced how the investigation was perceived. Trust, once shaken, does not return easily. The detectives knew this. They knew they were working not just against time, but against doubt hardened by years of disappointment. As winter deepened, so did the sense that something was close enough to feel, but not yet grasp. Every interview ended with the same phrase, spoken softly but firmly. If you remember anything else, anything at all, call us. It was an appeal to memory, to conscience, to whatever still lingered in the quiet corners of people's minds. The town listened, some with empathy, others with apprehension, all with the awareness that unresolved stories have a way of resurfacing when least expected. The woman remained absent, defined by what she had been and what she might have become. Her life, interrupted, cast a long shadow over the present. And as the investigation pushed forward, fueled by a tip that had changed everything without explaining anything, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever happened in Michigan in 2001 was not finished. It had simply been waiting, patient and unyielding, for the moment when someone would finally be unable to look away. The case moved again, not toward resolution, but toward revelation, and the ground beneath the town shifted subtly, ominously, as if preparing for an answer that would refuse to stay buried any longer. The first real fracture appeared where no one expected it, not in a dramatic confession or a recovered object, but in a timeline that refused to stay aligned. A receipt surfaced from a small diner off the highway, time-stamped less than an hour after the woman was last seen. It wasn't hers, not officially, but it belonged to someone who had insisted they were home that night, asleep, unreachable. The receipt had been dismissed years ago as irrelevant, a coincidence filed away and forgotten. Now it was pulled back into the light, its edges curled, its ink faded, but its timing stubbornly precise. Detectives reconstructed the night again, this time minute by minute, forcing events to coexist in the same space rather than allowing them to drift apart in memory. Snowfall records were checked, road conditions mapped, a detour here, a delay there. It became clear that if the woman had taken her usual route, she would have crossed paths with only a handful of vehicles during a narrow window of time. Fewer still if she deviated, if she was following someone or being followed. That realization tightened the scope and sharpened the questions. They returned to the stretch of road where cell service dropped, a place that had once seemed too obvious to matter. It cut through trees that stood like witnesses who had learned to keep their secrets. The area had been searched before, but searches are only as good as the assumptions behind them. This time, they weren't looking for remains. They were looking for signs of interruption. Tire marks beneath layers of frozen earth. Disturbed brush that didn't match animal patterns. Anything that suggested a stop where there shouldn't have been one. What they found was inconclusive and somehow worse for it. An indentation where a vehicle might have pulled off, old enough to blend into the landscape but recent enough to raise questions. A fragment of plastic, too generic to identify, too specific to ignore. Each item was catalogued, photographed, debated. Nothing screamed certainty, but everything whispered possibility. The detectives knew better than to fall in love with a theory, but they also knew that the case demanded risk, demanded they follow paths even when they might collapse under scrutiny. Back in town, the person named in the anonymous tip began to feel the pressure. Friends noticed changes, a shorter temper, a reluctance to answer calls. The calm confidence displayed in the interview room didn't hold as well in the outside world, where eyes lingered longer and conversations dropped when they entered. The town didn't need proof to start rearranging its loyalties. Suspicion, once seated, grows quickly, fed by years of unresolved fear. Investigators watched quietly, careful not to tip their hand. Surveillance is patient by design. They tracked routines, noting deviations that might mean nothing or everything. Late-night drives that followed no clear purpose. A visit to a storage facility, brief but repeated. Trash taken out at odd hours. Each action was logged, stripped of emotion, reduced to data. The detectives reminded themselves that nervous behavior does not equal guilt, that pressure can distort even innocent lives. Still, patterns matter, especially when they diverge from the past. The woman's family was informed that progress was being made, though the word itself felt inadequate. Progress toward what? An arrest? An explanation? Or just another dead end dressed up as hope? They attended meetings, nodded, asked careful questions, learned to read between the lines. They had lived too long with uncertainty to be fooled by optimism alone. Every new development reopened the same wound, a mix of anticipation and dread that never fully resolved. As the investigation intensified, old witnesses were called back in. Some were defensive, irritated at being asked the same questions again after so many years. Others were shaken, realizing how much they had forgotten, how many details had slipped away unnoticed. Memory is not a recording. It is an act of reconstruction, influenced by time, by stories heard, by fear of being wrong. The detectives navigated this carefully, cross-referencing statements, searching for consistencies that survived erosion. One witness broke down, not with a confession, but with frustration. They admitted they had lied once, not about the night itself, but about their certainty. They had said they were sure of what they saw because everyone else seemed sure too, because doubt felt dangerous in the immediate aftermath. That lie had shaped the investigation in subtle ways, steering attention away from one possibility and toward another. It was a reminder that errors don't have to be malicious to be destructive. The anonymous tip resurfaced again, indirectly. A second message arrived, shorter, less detailed, but unmistakably from the same source. It urged detectives not to focus solely on the obvious, not to assume a single actor, not to underestimate fear. The message ended abruptly, as if the sender had been interrupted or reconsidered. Attempts to trace it failed. Whoever they were, they remained in the shadows, influencing the case without stepping into it. The idea of more than one person involved changed the temperature of the room. Suddenly, gaps made sense. Silence could be shared. Alibis could be coordinated. The absence of physical evidence could be the result of cooperation rather than perfection. The detectives debated this late into the night, weighing the implications. If true, it meant the truth was distributed, fragmented across people who had spent years convincing themselves that staying quiet was the safest option. Community reaction intensified. Old friendships strained under the weight of suspicion. People replayed past interactions, searching for signs they might have missed. Every memory became suspect, every kindness potentially performative. The town felt smaller, tighter, as if the unresolved past were closing in from all sides. This was the cost of a cold case reawakening. It doesn't just hunt for answers. It forces everyone to confront who they were when it happened, and who they have become since. The detectives uncovered something else, buried deep in supplemental reports. A vehicle description that had never been followed up on because it didn't match any known suspect at the time. The color was common, the model forgettable, but paired with the new timeline it fit too well to ignore. Registration records were pulled, owners tracked down. Most were cleared quickly. One wasn't, not because of evidence but because of absence. Records missing. addresses outdated. A person who had slipped out of the system just enough to be invisible. That invisibility was unsettling. It suggested intention or at least opportunity. The detectives expanded their search, collaborating with agencies beyond the town, beyond the state. Each new inquiry carried the risk of exposing how fragile the case still was, how much depended on interpretation rather than proof. But isolation had failed them once. They weren't willing to let it fail again. As the investigation stretched forward, the woman's absence continued to define the present. Her name appeared in headlines again, framed by cautious language and renewed interest. The phrase cold case followed her like a shadow, a label that explained nothing and yet carried enormous weight. It meant unfinished business. It meant time had passed, but justice hadn't. Late one night, alone in the evidence room, a detective listened again to the gas station footage, not watching this time but listening. The hum of the lights, the faint murmur of voices, a sound in the background, almost lost. It wasn't clear enough to identify, but it was consistent, appearing again in other recordings from nearby locations. A vehicle, the same one maybe, the sound of it idling, waiting. The detective leaned back, exhausted, aware that certainty was still out of reach. But the pieces were closer now, brushing against each other in ways they never had before. The case was no longer dormant. It was restless, agitated, pushing back against the years that had tried to bury it. And somewhere, someone knew exactly how close the truth had come to the surface, close enough to be dangerous. The town slept uneasily, unaware of how many of its assumptions were about to be tested, how many familiar faces would soon be seen in a different light. The story that began in 2001 was accelerating again, pulling the present into its orbit, and it was becoming increasingly clear that when the answer finally emerged, it would not arrive gently. The pressure did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly, the way ice forms on a river before anyone notices the current has slowed. Detectives felt it first in the way phones were answered, in the delays between questions and responses, in the sudden need people had to clarify statements they had once delivered with confidence. The case had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a story about a woman who vanished. It was a story about what people had done, or failed to do, in the hours and years that followed. They began tracing the vehicle sound, isolating it from the background noise of the recordings, comparing it against others captured in the area that night. Engines have signatures, imperfect but recognizable when lined up side by side. The analysts worked without expectation, aware that confirmation bias could turn coincidence into conviction if left unchecked. When a pattern emerged, it wasn't definitive, but it was persistent. The same low idle, the same uneven rhythm, appearing near the gas station, near the stretch of road, near a location that had never been part of the original search perimeter. That location sat on the edge of town, neither remote nor central, the kind of place that blends into daily life precisely because it doesn't demand attention. Years ago, it had been a business that closed quietly, leaving behind a lot that filled with snow in winter and weeds in summer. No one remembered when it shut down. No one remembered who owned it now. That anonymity, once mundane, now felt deliberate. Investigators visited during daylight first, then returned after dark, listening, watching, letting the space speak in the ways it could. They found nothing dramatic. No evidence waiting to be discovered. Just signs of use long after the business had closed. Tire tracks from different seasons. Footprints overlapping, some fresh, some old. The implication was subtle but unsettling. This place had been visited regularly by someone who did not want to be seen, someone who preferred forgotten corners to public streets. The detectives added it to the map, another node in a network that was slowly taking shape. The person named in the anonymous tip was called in again. This time, the tone was different. Not confrontational, not accusatory, but relentless. The detectives asked about routes, about habits, about places that might not seem relevant to someone who had nothing to hide. The answers came slower now. The pauses lengthened. At one point, the person corrected themselves mid-sentence, a small slip that would have meant nothing in isolation. In context, it mattered. They asked about the abandoned property. The response was immediate denial, too immediate. No hesitation, no confusion. Just a firm no. The detectives noted it and moved on, aware that pressure works best when it doesn't linger in one place too long. When the interview ended, the person left visibly shaken, the calm they had cultivated years earlier now difficult to maintain. Outside the station, reporters waited. The story had reignited interest far beyond the town's borders. Headlines spoke of breakthroughs, of cracks in the case, of anonymous tips changing everything. The language was familiar, comforting in its promise of resolution. The detectives avoided it. They had learned that progress and truth do not always move together, and that expectation can be as dangerous as apathy. Behind closed doors, the cold case unit debated next steps. Search warrants were discussed, weighed against the risk of alerting anyone involved. Surveillance continued, expanded carefully. Financial records were reviewed again, this time with a focus on transactions that seemed insignificant at the time. Small cash withdrawals. Storage unit payments that began suddenly and ended just as abruptly. Nothing illegal on its own. Together, suggestive. The woman's family felt the shift even without details. They noticed how officials spoke, more cautiously now, less willing to speculate. That restraint was both reassuring and terrifying. It suggested seriousness, but also the possibility that answers, if they came, would be complicated. They prepared themselves for that, as much as anyone can prepare for a truth delayed by decades. Then came the search. Quiet, methodical, framed as routine. The abandoned property was cordoned off under the pretense of safety inspection. Ground-penetrating equipment scanned areas that had never been examined before. Investigators worked with the knowledge that expectations could distort perception, that they might see what they wanted to see. Hours passed, then days. The result was the same as so many before it. Nothing conclusive. No remains. No personal effects. Just disturbed earth and the lingering sense that the place mattered, even if it refused to explain why. The anonymous source remained silent, and that silence began to feel intentional. Detectives considered the possibility that the tipster was closer to the events than they had initially believed, that fear was now outweighing guilt. They issued carefully worded appeals, not to the public at large, but to anyone who may have information they once thought unimportant. It was an invitation to reconsider the past without explicitly accusing anyone of wrongdoing. Someone did reconsider. A former acquaintance of the person under scrutiny came forward, hesitant, conflicted. They spoke of a conversation years ago, a remark made half-jokingly, half-serious, about how easy it is to make things disappear in winter. At the time, it had been dismissed as dark humor. Now, it sounded different. The acquaintance had no proof, no direct knowledge, only unease that had never fully gone away. The detectives listened, knowing that unease is often where truth begins, even if it can't end there. They checked records related to that remark, searching for corroboration. Weather reports, travel logs, work schedules. Slowly, the picture tightened. The window of opportunity narrowed. The list of people who could have been where they needed to be, when they needed to be there, shrank. It did not shrink to one. That was the problem. The possibility of shared knowledge, shared responsibility, refused to disappear. Community tension escalated. People chose sides without realizing they were doing so. Some defended the person under scrutiny fiercely, citing years of normal behavior as evidence of innocence. Others pointed to subtle changes, to moments that now seemed ominous in hindsight. The town's history fractured into competing narratives, each trying to impose order on a past that resisted it. The detectives felt the weight of this, the responsibility not to let speculation harden into injustice. They moved deliberately, double-checking every step, aware that a miscalculation now could collapse the entire effort. Cold cases demand patience even when momentum is finally on your side. Especially then. Late one evening, as files were being reorganized yet again, a technician flagged an anomaly in archived audio. A voice, faint but distinct, layered beneath ambient noise in one of the recordings. It wasn't the woman's. It wasn't clearly identifiable. But it was there, and it hadn't been there before, at least not in a way anyone had noticed. The technician isolated it, enhanced it cautiously, mindful of introducing artifacts. The result was imperfect, but enough to raise a question that had never been asked. Who else was there? The question hung in the air, heavy, destabilizing. If someone else had been present, if the woman hadn't been alone in those final confirmed moments, then the entire narrative shifted. The case was no longer about disappearance. It was about interaction, about decisions made in proximity, about trust misplaced or exploited. The detectives sat with that realization, understanding that answers rarely arrive whole. They arrive in fragments, demanding interpretation, demanding restraint. The truth, whatever it was, remained incomplete, but it was closer now, close enough to feel its gravity pulling at the edges of everything else. Outside, the town carried on, unaware of how precariously its assumptions were balanced. Inside the investigation, certainty was still elusive, but doubt had become focused, directional. And in that focus, there was danger, for those who had built their lives on the belief that the past had finally gone quiet. The cold case was no longer cold. It was active, volatile, and increasingly intolerant of secrecy. And as the pieces continued to shift, one fact became impossible to ignore. Someone had been counting on time to erase what they knew. Time, it seemed, had other plans. The realization that someone else had been present changed how every prior assumption was weighed. It didn't explode the case, compressed it. Possibilities that once sprawled now folded inward, forcing connections that had been optional into becoming unavoidable. The detectives returned to the audio again and again, listening not for words, but for intention. The cadence of breath, the distance between sounds, the way one presence altered the behavior of another. It was forensic listening, and it demanded patience bordering on obsession. They compared the enhanced clip with others taken from nearby locations, building a quiet archive of background noise that had never been meant to matter. In one recording, the same faint voice appeared again, overlapping with the idling engine sound. In another, it vanished entirely. The pattern suggested movement, not randomness. Someone had been close, then closer, then gone. The timing aligned with the narrow window investigators had identified, the one that left no room for accidents. The person under scrutiny was interviewed a third time. This time, they brought in a specialist trained to watch not just answers but reactions to silence. The room was set deliberately plain. No photographs, no files on the table, just a recorder, a chair, and questions that arrived slowly. The detectives asked about routine, about memory, about sounds heard and not heard that night. The answers were less polished now, edges showing where certainty used to be. At one point, the person laughed briefly, inexplicably, then stopped. It was noted. Everything was noted. They played a portion of the audio, not the enhanced version, but the raw clip, letting it speak for itself. The person leaned forward, frowned, shook their head. Nothing there, they said. Just noise. The specialist watched closely as the sound replayed. When the faint voice emerged, barely perceptible, there was a flicker of recognition that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Too fast to confront directly. Too significant to ignore. Outside the room, the detectives reviewed what they had. Still no confession. Still no physical evidence that could anchor the case in court. But the psychological landscape was shifting. Pressure was working not by breaking defenses outright, but by narrowing the space in which lies could move comfortably. The person was no longer confident. They were managing. The abandoned property came back into focus. Investigators expanded their search radius, looking not just at the ground, but at access. Who could enter unnoticed? Who knew when it was empty? Utility records were pulled, revealing brief spikes of activity years ago that didn't match any known purpose. Someone had used the place quietly, temporarily. Enough to leave a trace. Not enough to leave an explanation. They followed that thread outward to storage units, garages, properties that changed hands quickly after the disappearance. Most leads fizzled. One didn't. A unit rented under a name that matched the person under scrutiny, but only partially. A middle initial instead of a full name. Clerical error, perhaps, or a deliberate softening of identity. The unit had been emptied long ago, its contents sold at auction, scattered beyond recovery. The absence felt intentional, the timing too precise to dismiss. The town felt the investigation tightening even without specifics. People sensed the shift the way animals sense weather changes, through behavior rather than information. Conversations became careful. Old jokes stopped landing. The past, once compartmentalized, pressed into the present, demanding acknowledgement. Some residents welcomed it, believing that truth, however painful, was preferable to endless speculation. Others resented it, fearing exposure more than uncertainty. The woman's family remained the quiet center of it all. They listened, absorbed, waited. They had learned not to ask for promises. Instead, they asked for honesty even when it offered little comfort. The detectives respected that. They spoke plainly when they could and said nothing when they couldn't. Trust, once broken by years of unanswered questions, was fragile, but it was there. Another witness came forward, this one younger at the time of the disappearance, now older and less willing to dismiss what they had seen. They described a car parked where it didn't belong, engine running, lights off. They hadn't reported it because it felt insignificant, because no one else seemed concerned, because they were afraid of being wrong. The description was vague, but the behavior matched what investigators suspected. Waiting, watching, choosing the right moment. The witness's statement was cross-checked against traffic data, weather conditions, and work schedules. It fit, not perfectly, enough. The detectives added it to the growing framework, aware that corroboration doesn't create truth, but it can point toward it. Each small alignment strengthened the structure, even as the foundation remained frustratingly incomplete. They confronted the person under scrutiny again, this time with fragments rather than accusations. The vehicle sound, the storage unit, the witness, each was presented as a question, not an indictment. The person grew defensive, then withdrawn. They denied everything, but the denial lacked conviction. It felt rehearsed, a script that had been used too many times. When asked why so many small details aligned against them, they had no answer beyond coincidence. Coincidence had carried the case for years. It was losing its credibility. Still, the law demands more than suspicion. The detectives knew this. They pushed for one more piece that could shift probability into proof. They revisited the gas station, the last confirmed location, examining it not as a crime scene, but as a social space. Who frequented it? Who lingered? Who knew when cameras were working and when they weren't? An employee from that time, now living out of state, remembered a regular who used to wait in the parking lot late at night, engine idling, saying they liked the quiet. The description was again vague. The implication was not. They compared the employee's recollection with employment records, time cards, shifts. The regular had been there that night. That much was certain. Whether that presence mattered was still an open question. But the repetition was difficult to ignore. Patterns, the detectives reminded themselves, are not proof, but they are rarely meaningless. As the investigation reached this stage, the anonymous source sent one final message. Short, direct, almost resigned. It warned that pushing further would force people to choose between self-preservation and truth. It did not say which choice had been made in 2001. It did not offer names. Then it went silent again, leaving behind a sense that whatever protection silence once provided was eroding. The detectives debated strategy late into the night. An arrest without sufficient evidence could doom the case permanently. Waiting risked losing momentum, losing witnesses, losing whatever fragile willingness remained. They balanced caution against urgency, aware that cold cases are unforgiving. One misstep can lock the door forever. The town waited, tense, divided. The woman's face appeared again in news segments, framed by words like breakthrough and turning point. Viewers leaned forward, hoping this time would be different. The detectives avoided those words. They knew better. They were not chasing closure. They were chasing accuracy. And yet, something had changed. The investigation no longer felt like a search in the dark. It felt like a narrowing corridor, walls closing in, options shrinking. Someone out there knew that. Someone had always known that. The question was whether they would speak before the corridor ended, or whether the truth would once again retreat, leaving only shadows and the lingering ache of a story that refused to resolve. As dawn approached on another sleepless night, a detective stood alone in the evidence room, surrounded by years of paper and possibility. The case was closer than it had ever been, close enough to hurt, close enough to be dangerous. And somewhere beyond those walls, the past waited, patient but no longer silent, ready to surface in whatever form it could. The cold case had not cracked. Not yet, but it was under strain. And strain, applied long enough, has a way of revealing exactly where things will break. The break, when it came, did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It arrived as fatigue. Not the physical kind, but the deeper exhaustion that settles in when a story has been told too many times and no longer holds together. The person under scrutiny began to contradict themselves in ways too small to challenge outright and too frequent to dismiss. Times shifted by minutes. Routes changed subtly. What had once been described as routine became uncertain, then vaguely remembered. The detectives noticed because they had nothing left to notice but detail. They laid the statements side by side, old and new, not to catch lies, but to understand evolution. Memory degrades. Lies mutate. The difference between the two is often visible only in hindsight. Here, the mutations followed a pattern. Each change created distance from a specific location, a specific window of time, a specific action that now carried new weight. The person was not forgetting randomly. They were retreating. Investigators revisited the abandoned property with fresh eyes, not looking for evidence this time, but for logistics. How long could someone be there without drawing attention? Where sound traveled? What could be seen from the road and what could not? They realized that the site offered something the rest of the town did not that night. Control. Control over visibility, over noise, over timing. It was not where something had to happen. It was where something could happen without interruption. They mapped the routes again, overlaying old traffic data with new assumptions. The corridor tightened further. Only a few paths allowed someone to move from the gas station area to that property without appearing on additional cameras. Fewer still allowed a return without notice. One of those paths matched the routine of the person under scrutiny almost perfectly. Not conclusively, uncomfortably. The detectives requested a voluntary polygraph. It was refused. That refusal was not evidence of guilt, but it was a signal. The tone changed. Lawyers entered the conversation. Statements were filtered. Cooperation cooled. The investigation had reached the edge of what could be done without confrontation. Everything from this point forward would carry consequences. Meanwhile, the anonymous source broke silence again, not with information, but with urgency. The message was fragmented, emotional, less controlled than the others. It spoke of fear, of pressure, of promises made long ago that were never meant to last this long. It hinted at more than one person knowing the truth, at a shared understanding that silence was mutual protection. It ended abruptly, as if the sender had said too much. The detectives treated the message cautiously. Emotional does not mean truthful, but it does mean unstable. Unstable sources act, sometimes recklessly, sometimes honestly. They prepared for both possibilities, increasing monitoring, tightening timelines, revisiting anyone who might fit the profile of someone desperate enough to speak and frightened enough to hide. Another interview was scheduled, this time with a secondary figure who had always existed on the periphery of the case. Someone connected socially, not romantically or professionally, but consistently. Presence at gatherings. A familiar face. They had never been a suspect, never raised alarms. Now, under renewed scrutiny, their story held together, but only just. They admitted they had been contacted years ago, asked vague questions, encouraged to remember the night in a particular way. At the time, they hadn't thought much of it. Now, they wondered why. That admission reframed everything. It suggested narrative management, an effort not just to hide the truth, but to shape the version of events that would survive. That kind of coordination does not happen by accident. It requires agreement, or fear, or both. The detectives felt the case tilt, not toward certainty, but toward complexity they could no longer ignore. They confronted the person under scrutiny with this new information. The reaction was immediate and unguarded. Anger, not at the accusation but at the betrayal implied. They demanded to know who had spoken, who had said what. It was the wrong response. Innocence does not usually manifest as outrage at exposure. The detectives noted it and ended the interview before it could escalate further. Legally, they were still stuck. Morally, the landscape was shifting fast. The case was no longer about whether something had happened. It was about how many people had helped it disappear. The idea settled heavily over the team. Cold cases rot not because of time alone, but because silence spreads, normalizes, becomes easier to maintain than truth. The woman's family sensed the change before being told. They had lived too long inside uncertainty not to recognize when it thickened into something else. When investigators finally explained that the case might involve more than one person, the reaction was not shock. It was recognition. A quiet, devastating confirmation of what they had suspected but never dared to articulate. That someone, somewhere, had chosen convenience over accountability. As pressure mounted, one of the peripheral figures began to unravel. They called detectives late one night, voice unsteady, asking questions that sounded like pleas disguised as curiosity. What happens if someone talks now? Does time matter? Does intention matter? The detectives answered carefully, truthfully. Time explains. It does not excuse. The call ended without a statement. But it did not feel like an ending. The town felt brittle. People watched each other, measured words, avoided old topics. The past was no longer a closed chapter. It was an active threat. Rumors circulated that arrests were imminent. Others claimed the investigation was stalling again. Both were wrong. The case was not stalling. It was coiling. Then came the discovery that forced action. Not physical evidence, not a body, but documentation. An old maintenance log from the abandoned property surfaced, buried in municipal archives. It showed after-hours access granted to a private individual during the period surrounding the disappearance. The name matched one already on the board. The log did not say why. It did not say how long. It only said access was authorized. Authorization implies permission. Permission implies conversation. Conversation implies knowledge. The detectives stared at the log in silence, aware that this was the closest they had come to anchoring suspicion in something tangible. It did not solve the case. It did not explain the woman's fate. But it established proximity and opportunity in a way that could not be argued away as coincidence. They moved quickly after that, securing warrants, freezing records, closing the distance they had been cautiously maintaining. The window for quiet observation had closed. Whatever was going to happen next would be visible, irreversible. And somewhere, the anonymous source knew it. Somewhere, someone who had lived for years inside a carefully maintained version of events felt the structure begin to fail. The truth had not emerged yet, but it was pressing hard enough to be felt. The cold case was approaching its breaking point. Not the kind that delivers answers cleanly, but the kind that forces choice. Speak, or be spoken for. When the warrants were served, they did not come with sirens or spectacle. No doors were kicked in. No statements were made. The detectives moved with the restraint of people who understood that noise could still scatter what little truth remained unspoken. Files were seized. Phones were cloned. Storage spaces were opened under neutral observation. Every action documented. Every reaction noted. This was not a raid. It was a reckoning measured in inches rather than miles. The person under scrutiny watched it happen with a controlled stillness that felt rehearsed. They complied, answered procedural questions, signed where indicated. Their hands shook only once, briefly, when a particular document was removed from a drawer they hadn't mentioned. It was an old map, folded and refolded until the creases had softened. Nothing illegal about owning a map. Everything unsettling about which area had been circled. Investigators did not comment. They didn't need to. The map spoke quietly, the way evidence often does when it has waited long enough. It didn't point to a body or a crime scene. It pointed to familiarity, to repeated presence, to someone who knew where to go without asking directions. The circle overlapped with the abandoned property and extended into a network of back roads that bypassed cameras and traffic lights alike. As word spread that warrants had been executed, the town's collective breath caught. This was different from renewed interest, different from interviews and speculation. This felt official, irreversible. People recalibrated their expectations in real time, revisiting assumptions they had held onto for years because letting go of them felt dangerous. Now, danger felt unavoidable. The peripheral figures tightened inward. Some cut off contact entirely. Others over-explained, offering details no one had asked for. One, the same individual who had called late at night with questions, finally asked to meet. They arrived pale, exhausted, eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to follow. They didn't confess. Not fully. They spoke in fragments. Of pressure. Of loyalty mistaken for obligation. Of being told that what happened was an accident, that talking would only make things worse. The detectives listened without interruption. They knew better than to rush a moment like this. When the person finally stopped speaking, what remained was not a confession, but an admission of knowledge. They had known something was wrong. They had known silence was protecting someone. They had chosen to stay quiet because the alternative felt unbearable at the time. Years later, the weight had become worse. That admission changed the calculus. Knowledge shared is complicity in the eyes of the law, but it is also leverage. The detectives explained the reality plainly. Cooperation mattered. Timing mattered. Truth, even delayed, mattered. The person nodded, tears forming but not falling, and asked for time. Not days, hours. Meanwhile, analysis of the seized devices began to yield results. Deleted messages, partially recovered, spoke in careful language. No explicit references. No names. Just arrangements. Meetings. Phrases that meant nothing without context and everything with it. One thread ended abruptly around the time of the disappearance and never resumed. Another picked up weeks later with a different tone, lighter, relieved, as if something heavy had been resolved. The anonymous source surfaced again, this time not digitally, but in person. They did not use their real name. They did not remove their coat. They sat rigidly, hands clenched, and spoke quickly, as if afraid courage might evaporate mid-sentence. They confirmed what detectives had begun to suspect. More than one person had been involved. Not in the same way, not with the same intent, but involved enough to ensure that nothing surfaced. They spoke of the night as something chaotic, misjudged, spiraling beyond control. Of decisions made to prevent consequences rather than to cause harm. Of a plan that did not exist until it had to. The detectives pressed for specifics. The source hesitated, then stopped. They would not say more. Not yet. Fear still held the upper hand. Even so, the meeting mattered. It validated the shape of the case. It confirmed that the silence had been coordinated, sustained by mutual vulnerability rather than shared malice. That distinction mattered legally. It mattered morally. It did not bring the woman back. The person under scrutiny was brought in again, this time with counsel present. The atmosphere was colder now, procedural, stripped of any pretense of collaboration. The detectives presented what they could without revealing everything. The map, the access logs, the recovered messages, the witness admissions. They did not accuse. They asked questions that no longer allowed room to maneuver. The responses were careful, clipped, filtered through legal advice. Denials continued, but they were narrower now, avoiding absolutes. When asked about the abandoned property, the answer changed. Yes, they had been there, once or twice, for reasons they struggled to articulate. It hadn't seemed important. It was a small concession, but it broke a line that had held for years. Outside, the town split along fault lines that had always been there. Some defended fiercely, insisting on innocence until proven otherwise. Others felt vindicated, anger replacing the fear that had kept them quiet. The woman's family stayed out of it, refusing to engage with speculation. They focused on what mattered to them. That the truth, whatever it was finally being forced into the open. The peripheral figure returned within the promised hours. They brought with them a piece of paper they had kept for years, folded and hidden, taken out and put away countless times. It wasn't evidence in the traditional sense. It was a timeline they had written for themselves, trying to make sense of conflicting accounts. It placed people in places they had denied being. It included one detail the detectives hadn't known. A vehicle had been moved that night. Not driven away. Moved. From one location to another briefly and then returned. The purpose had been to create normalcy. To ensure nothing looked out of place. That detail explained gaps that had puzzled investigators for decades. It also implicated more than one person in the act of concealment. The room went quiet as the implication settled. This was no longer a case built on inference alone. It had structure now. Motive. Opportunity. Assistance. The detectives thanked the person and began the slow, careful process of verifying everything. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Cold cases punish haste. As dawn approached, the town woke to a new reality. The story was no longer about whether the case would ever be solved. It was about how much of the truth would survive the process of being told. The pressure that had been building for years had reached its limit. Something had to give. And somewhere in that tightening circle, the woman's absence felt louder than ever, as if the space she left behind were finally being acknowledged for what it was. Not a mystery to be managed, but a wound that had never closed. The cold case had entered its most dangerous phase. Not because answers were far away, but because they were close enough to demand accountability. And accountability, once invoked, does not stop until it has named what happened and who allowed it to remain hidden for so long. The moment accountability entered the room, the case stopped being theoretical. It gained weight, consequences, the kind of gravity that pulls people out of the comfort of abstraction and into the sharp edges of reality. Detectives moved carefully now, not because they lacked confidence, but because the margin for error had collapsed. Every step would be examined, challenged, remembered. The truth, once exposed, would not be allowed to retreat again. Verification became the priority. The timeline handed over by the peripheral figure was dissected line by line, cross-referenced against data old and new. Traffic sensors confirmed brief anomalies that had once been dismissed as glitches. A vehicle appearing where it shouldn't have been, then disappearing just as quickly. Fuel purchase records aligned with mileage that no one had questioned before. Individually, the details were weak. Together, they formed a narrative that finally explained how normalcy had been manufactured in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. The moved vehicle was identified, not definitively but enough to narrow the field. It belonged to someone tangentially connected, someone whose name appeared in the file so early it had been taken for granted. A helper, fixer, someone who understood that the fastest way to kill suspicion is to restore routine. The detectives realized that the absence of panic the following morning, the sense that nothing had changed, had not been accidental. It had been constructed. They brought that person in quietly. No cameras. No spectacle. The interview room felt smaller this time, not because it had changed, but because the questions left less room to breathe. At first, the answers were automatic muscle memory from years of repetition. But when presented with the reconstructed timeline, with moments placed side by side that had never been aligned before, the story faltered. Not dramatically, just enough. Silence followed. Not the defiant kind, the tired kind. The kind that comes when the cost of maintaining a lie finally outweighs the cost of abandoning it. The person asked for water, then asked how much the detectives knew. It was the oldest question in the room, and it marked the moment everything shifted. Innocent people ask if they're suspected. Guilty people ask how far the truth has traveled. They didn't confess. Not fully sell. They acknowledged being asked for help. Framed it as loyalty, as confusion, as a favor done without understanding the implications. They insisted they hadn't known what had happened to the woman. only that something had gone wrong and needed to be handled. The word hung in the air, vague and damning. Handling implies agency. It implies awareness. It implies choice. The detectives pressed gently, then stopped. They had what they needed for now. Partial truths are still truths, and they tend to lead to the rest. Outside the room, the case file was reorganized yet again, this time around roles rather than individuals. Primary actor, secondary assistants, tertiary silence. The structure clarified motive without needing to name it outright. The person under scrutiny was watching all of this unfold from a distance they had never expected. Their legal posture hardened, but their demeanor frayed. The map, the access logs, the witnesses, the helpers. The narrative they had relied on for years was collapsing inward, leaving fewer places to hide. They stopped returning calls, stopped attending familiar routines. Withdrawal replaced confidence, a signal detectives recognized well. The anonymous source, having crossed the line into visibility, did not retreat. They sent one final message, this one stripped of ambiguity. It did not describe the act itself. It described the aftermath. Panic, arguments, the realization that nothing could be undone. It described a decision made not to save someone, but to save themselves. That distinction mattered. It reframed the case from tragedy to betrayal. Prosecutors were brought in, not to announce charges, but to assess viability. Cold cases are fragile in court. Juries demand certainty that time erodes. The prosecutors listened, asked pointed questions, challenged assumptions. They agreed on one thing quickly. The case would not hinge on a single revelation. It would hinge on convergence, on the accumulation of small truths aligning so tightly they could no longer be dismissed. The woman's family was informed that arrests were possible, but not imminent. They received the news with a restraint born of long experience. They had learned not to attach themselves to timelines. Instead, they asked what mattered most to them. Would the truth be told? Would responsibility be acknowledged? The detectives could not promise outcomes. They promised effort. It was the only promise they could keep. The town lived in suspension. Businesses buzzed with speculation. Old conversations were revisited with new subtext. People wondered what they had missed, what they had ignored, and whether ignorance had been a choice. The case had become a mirror, reflecting not just a crime, but a culture of quiet accommodation. It made people uncomfortable. That discomfort was necessary. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on the helpers. Cooperation agreements were discussed. Consequences outlined. The difference between being complicit and being corrective was explained in plain language. One by one, the peripheral figures began to recalibrate their priorities. Silence, once shared, began to feel isolating. Loyalty, once protective, began to feel misdirected. One of them broke further, offering a detail that shifted the emotional center of the case. The woman had been alive longer than assumed. Not long. Long enough to matter. Long enough for decisions to be made in real time. That revelation reframed everything. It stripped away the comfort of inevitability and replaced it with responsibility. Whatever happened next had not been forced by circumstance. It had been chosen. The detectives absorbed this quietly. They did not react. They did not comfort. They recorded. This was not a moment for emotion. It was a moment for accuracy. The detail was corroborated cautiously, aligned with timelines and witness accounts. It fit. Horribly, it fit. The person under scrutiny was confronted with this new convergence. Not as an accusation, but as a question that could no longer be deflected. The response was delayed, then defensive, then incoherent, finally silence. The kind that signals collapse rather than resistance. Counsel intervened. The interview ended, but something fundamental had shifted. The denial that had once been expansive was now brittle, easily fractured. As night fell, the cold case unit worked without pause. Warrants were amended. Charges were discussed in conditional language. Everything depended on what could be proven, not what was known. That distinction weighed heavily. Truth and proof rarely arrive together, especially after decades of delay. And yet, the case was no longer haunted by absence alone. It was haunted by presence. By the knowledge that people had been there, had acted, had chosen silence over intervention. The woman's disappearance was no longer a mystery suspended in time. It was a sequence of decisions, each one compounding the last. The cold case had not just cracked. It had exposed a network of choices that could no longer be defended as misunderstanding or fear. The final shape of accountability was still forming, but its outline was unmistakable. Somewhere between night and morning, as files were closed and reopened, one detective paused, staring at the woman's photograph, not as evidence, as a reminder that every step taken now had to honor not just the process, but the life interrupted by it. The truth was close enough to hurt, close enough to demand an ending. And endings, when they finally arrive, are never as clean as anyone hopes. The case entered a phase that felt less like investigation and more like excavation. What lay beneath was no longer hidden by darkness, but by layers of justification that had hardened over time. Each interview peeled back one layer, revealing another beneath it, thinner, weaker, closer to the core. The detectives moved slowly, aware that pressure applied too quickly could fracture the truth into pieces too small to reassemble. Prosecutors authorized a strategic shift. No more broad questioning. No more open-ended conversations. Each person would be approached with a specific slice of the story, a fragment already corroborated, already anchored to something tangible. The goal was not to shock. It was to corner inconsistency until it had nowhere left to go. The helper who had admitted to moving the vehicle was brought back in. This time, the discussion centered on timing. Minutes, not hours, not general impressions. Minutes. When exactly had they received the call? How long it took to arrive? What they saw first? At first, the answers came quickly. Then they slowed. The helper asked to stop twice, then continued anyway, voice dropping as the realization set in that precision was the enemy now. They admitted the call had been urgent. Not panicked, but controlled, which somehow made it worse. They had been told not to ask questions. That everything was under control. That the woman was taken care of. The phrase landed heavily, stripped of any ambiguity it might once have carried. The helper insisted they had interpreted it as meaning safe. Looking back, they knew that interpretation had been chosen, not assumed. The detectives did not argue. They let the words stand. They knew the power of allowing someone to hear their own language without interruption. Silence filled the room again, and in that silence, the helper's certainty dissolved. They began to correct themselves, then stopped, realizing too late that each correction revealed more than the original statement. Elsewhere, analysis of the seized phones produced something that had been hiding in plain sight. A series of unsent drafts, messages typed, revised, deleted, never transmitted. They spanned weeks after the disappearance, each one circling the same idea without naming it. Regret, fear, a desire to explain that never overcame the instinct to survive. One draft ended mid-sentence, as if the writer had lost the nerve to finish the thought. Linguistic analysis suggested more than one author. Devices had been shared, passwords known, privacy compromised by trust. The implication was clear. Communication had been collaborative even if action had not been. The silence that followed had not been accidental. It had been negotiated. The person under scrutiny was isolated now, not physically but narratively. Others were speaking cautiously, incrementally, but enough to redraw the outline of events. The story no longer centered on mystery. It centered on containment, on how a situation had been assessed, minimized, managed. The disappearance was no longer the focal point. The response to it was. When confronted with the existence of the drafts, the person under scrutiny reacted differently than before. Not anger, not denial, something closer to resignation. They asked whether the messages proved anything. The detectives answered honestly. On their own, no. In context, yes. Context had become the most dangerous word in the room. They pressed once more on the question that now defined the case. Why had no one called for help? The response came after a long pause. Fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of exposure. Fear of being seen as responsible for something that had escalated beyond intention. It was not a justification. It was an explanation. And explanations, while human, do not absolve harm. The woman's family was updated again, this time with more specificity. They were told that investigators believed there had been a window, brief but real, where intervention was possible. The room went quiet. Grief does not always announce itself with sound. Sometimes it settles in the body, heavy and unmoving. The family asked no questions. There were none that could soften the answer. In the town, lines hardened. Sympathy shifted. The narrative people had lived with for years, that of a sudden, inexplicable loss, gave way to something far more disturbing. The idea that choices had been made. That fear had outweighed compassion. That silence had been easier than responsibility. The town was forced to confront not just what happened, but what it might have done under similar pressure. One of the peripheral figures requested a formal cooperation agreement. They arrived with counsel, demeanor subdued, prepared to trade what they knew for a measure of leniency. Their statement filled in gaps investigators hadn't known how to articulate. The argument, the moment things went wrong, the immediate pivot from concern to calculation, the group decision, unspoken but understood, that involving authorities would ruin lives. The detectives listened without reacting, focusing on corroboration. Names, times, locations. The statement aligned with much of what had already been gathered. It contradicted some details, but not in ways that undermined the core. The truth, it seemed, was stabilizing, settling into a shape that no longer shifted dramatically when touched. Charges were drafted, revised, redrafted. Each word mattered. Each inference had to be supported. The prosecutors debated strategy late into the night, aware that the case would be scrutinized not just by a jury, but by a community that had lived with uncertainty for decades. Overreach would be punished. Hesitation could be fatal. The person under scrutiny was informed that arrest was likely. Not certain. Likely. The distinction mattered. They reacted with a quiet that felt final. No outburst. No plea. Just a long exhale, as if something they had been holding finally slipped from their grasp. Counsel advised silence. For the first time, silence felt less like control and more like surrender. As the night deepened, the cold case unit reviewed everything from the beginning, ensuring that nothing had been contaminated by momentum. Cold cases collapse when enthusiasm replaces discipline. They refused to let that happen. Every piece was revalidated. Every assumption challenged. The truth, hard won, deserved that respect. Outside, the town waited. Some hoped for closure. Others feared exposure. Everyone felt the weight of proximity. The case was no longer about the past alone. It was about who people had been when it mattered and who they were now. The woman's absence, once an abstract ache, had become painfully specific. Not just a life lost, but a series of moments denied. That realization hung over everything, a reminder that the cost of silence is never theoretical. The cold case was approaching its legal endgame. Not an ending that would satisfy everyone. Not an ending that would erase the years. But an ending that would name choices, assign responsibility, and force the truth into the open, where it could no longer be reshaped by fear. Whatever came next would not restore what was taken. But it would ensure that what happened in Michigan in 2001 would no longer belong to rumor and shadow alone. It would belong to record. Morning arrived without ceremony, gray light pressing against courthouse windows like a witness waiting to be called. Inside, the air carried a tension that no one tried to disguise. The case file lay open on polished wood, pages marked, annotated, worn thin by hands that had carried it for years. This was no longer a cold case drifting on memory. It had weight now. Names, decisions, consequences. The first arrest came quietly. No flashing lights. No cameras tipped off in advance. Just a knock, measured and deliberate, delivered by officers who understood that restraint would speak louder than spectacle. The individual complied without protest. Shoes on, jacket grabbed. A glance back at a house that had held secrets longer than anyone had suspected. The door closed. Something ended there even if the story did not. News traveled faster than the patrol car. By the time the booking photo was taken, the town already knew. Phones buzzed. Radios murmured. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people tried to reconcile the familiar with the unthinkable. This was not an outsider. This was someone woven into the everyday fabric. Someone who had shared sidewalks, greetings, small talk about weather and school schedules. Shock is amplified when it wears a known face. The affidavit was unsealed by noon. It did not read like a dramatic reveal. It read like an anatomy lesson. Clinical, sequential, unforgiving. It laid out the argument, the escalation, the moment control slipped, the failure to call for help, the decision to conceal. Each paragraph tightened the narrative, reducing years of speculation to a chain of choices that could no longer be denied. Defense counsel responded immediately, disputing intent, challenging timelines, emphasizing uncertainty. Words like alleged and inconclusive returned to the conversation, attempting to reintroduce doubt where investigators had worked so carefully to remove it. The legal battle was beginning, and with it came a familiar transformation. The story shifted again, from what happened to what could be proven. A second arrest followed, then a third. Not all at once. Staggered. Strategic. Each one recalibrated the town's sense of scale. This had not been a single failure. It had been a shared one. The idea settled uncomfortably, forcing people to confront the difference between individual guilt and collective silence. It is easier to condemn one person than to ask why others stayed quiet. In the courtroom, the woman's name was spoken repeatedly, attached now to motions and exhibits. It was a strange form of presence, her identity resurfacing through legal language after years of absence. Her family sat together, hands folded, eyes forward. They had waited a long time for this room, this moment, this acknowledgement that what they had lost mattered enough to pursue, no matter how late. The prosecution's theory was clear. Not a premeditated plan, but a sequence of panicked decisions driven by self-preservation. An accident followed by fear. Fear followed by concealment. Concealment followed by years of silence reinforced by mutual dependence. The anonymous tip, once dismissed as unreliable, now stood as the fracture point, the moment the sealed system finally failed. Defense teams attacked the tip relentlessly. Who was the caller? Why now? What motive? The answer, unsatisfying and powerful, remained the same. Conscience does not operate on a schedule. Sometimes it waits until the cost of carrying truth outweighs the cost of revealing it. That explanation would never satisfy a cross-examination, but it resonated beyond the courtroom walls. Evidence hearings stretched on, meticulous and slow. Forensic findings were reintroduced, contextualized by the new statements. What had once seemed insignificant now aligned with testimony. Small details locking into place with an audible sense of finality. A scuffed shoe, a missing hour, a vehicle out of position. None of it dramatic alone. Together, devastating. Outside, the town fractured into camps. Some demanded swift justice. Others warned against rushing to judgment. Yard signs appeared, then disappeared. Conversations grew cautious. Trust, once assumed, now required proof. This was the unseen cost of long-buried crimes. They do not remain contained. They leak into the present, altering how people see one another long after the original harm was done. The cold case unit watched from a distance as the process moved beyond them. Their role had changed. No longer hunters, they were custodians of record, ensuring that what they had uncovered survived adversarial scrutiny. They attended hearings, answered questions, clarified procedures. They resisted the urge to defend emotionally. Facts were their only protection now. One night, long after the courthouse emptied, an investigator returned to the office and pulled the original missing person report from storage. Yellowed, sparse. A life reduced to a few lines and a photograph. They sat with it longer than necessary, aware that this was where the story had truly begun. Not with arrests, not with confessions, with a disappearance that had been too easy to explain away. The woman's family released a brief statement. No anger, no demands, just acknowledgement, gratitude for persistence, hope for accountability, and understanding that whatever the outcome, the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Sometimes that is the closest thing to closure available. As the legal machinery continued its slow rotation, one fact remained unchanged. Nothing would return what was lost. No verdict could restore time or possibility. But something fundamental had shifted. The case was no longer defined by absence alone. It was defined by reckoning. The Michigan 2001 cold case, once a whisper, now stood at the center of a reckoning that would test memory, loyalty, and the limits of forgiveness. The end was closer than it had ever been. Not the end of grief, not the end of consequence, but the end of silence, finally broken, echoing through a community that would never again be able to say it didn't know. The final phase unfolded without spectacle, as endings often do when the damage has already been done. Courtrooms are built for resolution, but they cannot contain the weight of years, and everyone inside understood that whatever verdicts emerged would arrive too late to feel like triumph. The proceedings moved forward anyway, driven not by hope for restoration, but by the obligation to finish what had been started. Testimony traced the same arc again and again, each witness approaching the truth from a slightly different angle, each voice adding texture to a story that no longer belonged to any single person. The argument that night resurfaced not as drama, but as fact. Raised voices, a push, a fall. A moment where time narrowed to seconds and a decision had to be made. The decision was not to call for help. That choice echoed louder than anything that followed. Experts spoke about fear responses, about how ordinary people make catastrophic choices under pressure. The explanations were clinical, almost comforting in their neutrality, but they did not change the outcome. Understanding why something happens does not undo what it causes. The courtroom absorbed this contradiction in silence, the way it absorbs everything, filing emotion beneath procedure. The defense leaned heavily on uncertainty. No direct witness to the fatal moment. No definitive cause established beyond reasonable doubt. The gaps were real. They always had been. Cold cases leave scars in the evidentiary record that can never be fully healed. The prosecution acknowledged this without flinching, arguing instead that the absence of clarity was itself the result of deliberate concealment. You cannot erase the trail and then claim there is no path. When the jury retired, the town held its breath. Not because people expected a clean answer, but because waiting had become a reflex learned over decades. Some sat in parked cars outside the courthouse. Others refreshed news feeds, unable to focus on anything else. The woman's family returned to a quiet room, familiar now with the peculiar exhaustion that follows hope. The verdicts, when they came, were measured. Guilty on some counts, not guilty on others. A mosaic of accountability rather than a single sweeping judgment. There was no gasp, no outcry, just a collective exhale, heavy and incomplete. Justice, when delayed this long, rarely arrives in a form that feels whole. Sentencing followed weeks later. Statements were read. Apologies offered, some halting, some rehearsed, some clearly overdue. The words hung in the air, weighed by the knowledge that they could never reach the person they were meant for. Regret is loud when it is finally spoken, but it cannot travel backward. The woman's family addressed the court last. They spoke of ordinary things, birthdays missed, habits remembered, a voice they could still hear in their minds. They did not ask for maximum punishment. They asked for acknowledgement, for the record to reflect that her life mattered beyond the circumstances of her death. The judge listened, and for a moment, the room felt less like a courtroom and more like a vigil. When it was over, people drifted back into their lives carrying a new version of the past. The mystery was gone, replaced by something heavier. Knowledge. The town would no longer be known for a disappearance with no answers. It would be known for what happened after, for how long fear kept truth buried, for how many years it took for conscience to speak. The cold case unit closed the file with a final notation. Resolved does not mean healed. It means concluded. The distinction mattered to them. They had not chased the story for closure. They had chased it because unanswered questions corrode trust, and because silence, left unchallenged, becomes a precedent. In the months that followed, the woman's name appeared less frequently in headlines, but it did not disappear. A scholarship was established. A bench placed near the park she used to walk through. Small acts, insufficient on their own, but meaningful in their intent. Memory, after all, is another form of justice, quieter but persistent. Sometimes, late at night, people in the town still replay the story in their minds, searching for the moment where everything could have changed. The call that wasn't made. The door that didn't open. The truth that waited too long to be told. These questions have no answers that satisfy, only lessons that linger. The Michigan 2001 cold case no longer lives in rumor or shadow. It lives in record, in testimony, in the collective awareness of a community forced to reckon with its own reflection. The mystery is gone, but the unease remains, a reminder that the most devastating secrets are rarely hidden by strangers. They are hidden by people we know.